Dublin streets were unusually quiet that night, the kind of quiet that presses on the ears until you can hear your own breath. Streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long, wavering shadows over rows of terraced houses, and somewhere far off, a dog barked and then went silent again. It was the 1990s, and Ireland was changing, economically, politically, and socially, but underneath the surface, another transformation was underway. Whispers traveled through pubs and alleyways about a new group, one that didn't operate like the old neighborhood gangs. This was not a handful of hot-headed youths fighting over scraps. This was something more deliberate, more patient, more dangerous. A new criminal order was quietly taking shape, and its name would soon become one of the most feared in Europe, the Kinahan Cartel. There was something eerie about how quickly their influence began to spread. To an outsider, Dublin might have looked like any other city recovering from decades of economic struggle, with young men out of work, looking for purpose or trouble, depending on which came first. But to those paying attention, a pattern was emerging: shipments of drugs were getting larger, rival crews were being outmaneuvered, and a man known as Christy Kinahan was beginning to step out of the shadows. He wasn't flashy like the gangland figures who came before him. He didn't seek attention. In fact, he thrived on the opposite: calm control, quiet deals, and a reputation built not through headlines, but through whispered warnings passed from one criminal to the next. Imagine, for a moment, sitting in a small Dublin bar, the air thick with cigarette smoke, as two men lean close over a table. Their voices are barely above a whisper. They're not gossiping about football or politics. They're speaking of someone whose name carries weight, someone who can bring in shipments worth millions, someone who can make a man disappear if he crosses the wrong line. The tone is not of excitement but of caution, almost reverence. This is how the Kinahan name began to travel, not through bold announcements, but through murmurs that reached every corner of the city's underworld. The early 1990s were the perfect breeding ground for an empire like this. Ireland was only beginning to emerge from its economic troubles, and for many, the promise of the Celtic Tiger was still years away. Jobs were scarce, money even scarcer, and the streets were filled with restless energy. For those who didn't want to wait for slow progress, there were faster ways to climb out of poverty, ways that involved risk, adrenaline, and quick money. Christy Kinahan understood this better than most. He had already served time, already tasted the system, and instead of being broken by it, he seemed to grow sharper, more calculating. Prison, for him, became less a punishment and more a classroom where he studied the mechanics of crime, learned from smugglers, and even picked up languages that would later help him expand across Europe. This first chapter in the Kinahan story is not filled with the roaring violence that would later dominate headlines. Instead, it is quiet, methodical, almost unnervingly patient. The groundwork is being laid: connections with suppliers, deals with distributors, a network that stretches further with each passing month. The atmosphere is thick with a sense of inevitability, as though something large and unstoppable is gathering momentum just out of sight. People in the underworld begin to speak not of if Christie will dominate, but when. At night, Dublin's port areas become scenes of hushed activity: ships unloading, packages transferred with precision, men moving quickly before the first light of dawn. There is tension, yes, but also a strange calm, as though each person involved knows their role in a larger plan. Christie's reputation for discipline means that mistakes are rare and betrayal is met with swift consequences. This is not a chaotic street crew prone to infighting. This is organized crime with a vision. And yet, there is also a certain glamour beginning to surround the Kinahan name. In some circles, they are spoken of with admiration, the way young men might speak of a daring outlaw. The promise of wealth, of power, of belonging to something bigger than oneself, it is a powerful lure. For many, the chance to work for the Kinahans is not just a job, but an opportunity to escape the drudgery of ordinary life. Of course, what they often fail to see is the price such loyalty demands. The city itself feels like it is holding its breath. Police investigations are slow, often a step behind. Journalists catch wind of something, but the picture is still blurry, still incomplete. To the average citizen, the Kinahan name is not yet a headline, just a rumor. But the stage is being set for something that will eventually spill out into the open and draw worldwide attention. The cartel's story is still in its first act, but already you can feel its pull, an invisible thread connecting the quiet streets of Dublin to the glittering boxing arenas and sun-soaked villas that will one day be part of this tale. As the night deepens, the city seems to grow stiller, as though listening. In the silence, one can almost hear the future rushing toward it, the feuds, the bloodshed, the international manhunts. But for now, everything is just beginning. The players are taking their places, the alliances are forming, and a criminal empire is being born, an empire that will not only change the face of Irish organized crime but will eventually hold the world of professional boxing in its grip. Christy Kinahan was not born into power, but into a Dublin where survival was often the first lesson a boy had to learn. The 1950s and 60s were not gentle years for Ireland's working class. Rows of grey council houses lined the streets, children played in alleys littered with scraps of rubbish, and the air often smelled faintly of coal smoke. In these neighborhoods, the line between mischief and crime could be razor thin. For young Christy, the world outside the front door was a school of hard knocks, where cleverness and quick reflexes were sometimes more valuable than any formal education. He was not the loudest boy, nor the most reckless, but even then he seemed to carry himself differently. Friends and neighbors would later recall that Christy had a sharp mind, always watching, always listening. Where other boys might boast about a stolen bike or a fight won, he seemed more interested in understanding how things worked, who owed who, which corner boys sold what, which police officers could be bribed and which ones could not. He was studying before he even realized it, learning the invisible patterns of the street. Like many young men of his generation, Christy's early run-ins with the law were almost expected. A stolen car here, a burglary there, nothing that made headlines, but enough to earn him a place on the Garda's radar. What set him apart, though, was how quickly he adapted. When others were caught and returned to the same petty crimes, Christy used each scrape as a lesson. Prison was not a dead end but an education. He absorbed everything, how shipments were moved, how passports were forged, even how to read financial documents. By the time he served a sentence in the 1980s for a major drug offense, he had transformed from a street criminal into something far more formidable, a man with vision. Imagine him sitting in a cold cell at night, the concrete walls closing in, but his mind working endlessly. Perhaps he thought of his childhood streets, of the narrowness of life there, and resolved never to return to that kind of powerlessness. Perhaps he thought of the men who seemed untouchable, the ones who moved millions and never got their hands dirty. Christy's ambition began to crystallize. If he was going to risk his freedom, it would not be for small profits. It would be for something bigger, an empire. Outside the prison walls, Dublin was beginning to shift. The heroin epidemic of the 1980s had torn through entire communities, leaving devastation in its wake. Local gangs fought over territories, addicts stole to feed their habits, and a new kind of organized crime was beginning to take root. Christy saw opportunity in the chaos. If he could position himself as the man who could supply product more efficiently, with better connections and more discipline than anyone else, he could dominate the trade. But it wasn't just about drugs. Christy had a knack for networking, for finding allies who could open doors. He built relationships not only with Irish criminals, but with British smugglers, Dutch brokers, and eventually, contacts in Spain and beyond. He began to see Ireland not as the end of the map, but as a launch pad. The real money was in international routes, getting cocaine from South America, heroin from Asia, moving it across Europe with military-like precision. It is worth pausing here, letting the listener feel the weight of this transformation. Christy was no longer just one man trying to make a living. He was becoming something larger, a figure with plans that reached far beyond Dublin's borders. He traded flashy violence for quiet efficiency. He was not the type to pose for photos with gold chains or to give interviews bragging about his wealth. His power was the kind you felt in the silence that followed when someone mentioned his name. Even so, the road was not without blood. The drug trade is rarely clean, and debt sometimes needed to be collected in ways that made examples of those who dared to cross him. Christy did not relish chaos, but he understood its use. Violence became, for him, a tool, something applied sparingly, but with enough force to keep others in line. This careful balance of fear and respect would become the foundation of his reputation. There is an image, almost cinematic, of Christy in those years, walking through a Dublin market, coat collar turned up against the wind, nodding to people who stepped quickly out of his way. The city is grey and damp, but his mind is already somewhere else, thinking of shipments, routes, and profits. He is playing a long game, one few others can even see. This is the period when he begins to earn the nickname that will follow him for life, the Dapper Don, a reference to his sharp dress, calm demeanor, and growing status as Ireland's most sophisticated criminal. And yet, there is something almost paradoxical about this stage of his life. For all the wealth beginning to flow through his hands, Christy remains elusive, almost ghost-like. He does not court celebrity. He avoids unnecessary attention. It is as if he knows that true power is quiet, and that survival in his world depends on staying a step removed from the spotlight. As the 1990s approach, Christy Kinahan is no longer just another Dublin criminal. He is on the verge of something much bigger. His network is in place, his connections abroad are solidifying, and his understanding of logistics has turned smuggling into an art form. The pieces on the board are arranged exactly as he wants them, and soon, the Kinahan name will no longer be a whisper, it will be a force felt across continents. In the stillness of a Dublin night, the seeds of an empire are taking root. The city does not know it yet, but a new era of organized crime is about to dawn. And at its center stands a man whose mind is sharper than any blade, whose patience is longer than any sentence, and whose ambition will one day shake the foundations of Ireland's underworld. The 1980s and early 1990s were Christy Kinahan's crucible years, the time when he shifted from small-scale hustler to architect of a sprawling criminal machine. Dublin was restless, with unemployment high and heroin still devastating entire communities. In this volatile environment, Christie's operations grew bolder, and his name began to circulate not just in the pubs and estates of Dublin but in police reports and customs briefings across Europe. This was the era when the first true blueprint of what would later be called the Kinahan Cartel was drawn. Christie's first major crimes were not random. They were carefully chosen stepping stones, each one bigger than the last, each one expanding his reach. He realized early that to control the drug trade, he could not simply be a buyer or a street-level seller, he had to become the man who controlled the flow itself. That meant going beyond Dublin, beyond Ireland even, and building direct supply lines that would bypass middlemen. It was a risky ambition, but Christy was willing to take the risk if it meant he could sit at the top of the chain. Picture the docks at night, cargo containers lined up like sleeping giants, the salty air heavy with the smell of the sea. Somewhere in that maze of steel boxes, a shipment arrives that is not on any official manifest. Men in dark jackets work quickly, quietly, moving packages from one container to another before the customs officers make their next sweep. Christy is not there in person, he rarely is, but his hand is in every detail. This is where his genius begins to show. He is not a thug kicking down doors. He is a strategist orchestrating a logistics operation that rivals legitimate shipping companies. Customs seizures from this period tell part of the story. Shipments of heroin and cannabis resin intercepted at Irish ports begin to follow a pattern, suggesting a single major supplier behind them. The Gardaí suspect Christy, but catching him is another matter entirely. He is meticulous, operating through layers of intermediaries, ensuring that if one link is broken, the chain still holds. This patience and planning earn him respect even among rivals. In the world of organized crime, surviving is an achievement, thriving is something closer to legend. Of course, law enforcement does score victories, and Christy does not escape unscathed. One of the defining moments of this era is his arrest and imprisonment in the Netherlands, where he is caught in connection with a large heroin smuggling case. For many criminals, this would be a career-ending blow. But for Christy, prison becomes something else entirely, a networking event, a school, a think tank. He meets criminals from across Europe, absorbs their knowledge, learns more about the routes from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and studies how to use front companies and fake paperwork to disguise illicit shipments. Imagine him in a prison yard, walking slowly, speaking quietly with other inmates. There is no wasted time here, every conversation is a potential connection, every favor traded a future asset. By the time Christy is released, he is more dangerous than before, equipped with a web of contacts stretching from South America to continental Europe. The sentence that was meant to stop him has, paradoxically, prepared him to build something far larger than before. When he returns to freedom, Dublin feels too small for him. The city that once defined his world is now just a node in a much bigger network. He begins to spend more time abroad, especially in Spain and the Netherlands, using these countries as hubs for importing narcotics. His operations become more sophisticated, using encrypted communications, shell companies, and money laundering schemes that make it harder for investigators to trace anything directly back to him. And yet, for all the growth of his empire, Christy remains disciplined. Unlike flashier gang leaders, he does not flaunt his wealth. There are no extravagant parties for the newspapers to photograph, no gold chains to draw attention. This is a man who has learned that invisibility is power. The wealth he accumulates is invested into properties, businesses, and safe havens abroad. He is building something meant to last, something that will outlive any single police raid or crackdown. Still, the streets of Dublin remain dangerous. Rivals lurk, ready to exploit any weakness, and Christy knows he must protect his growing empire. It is during this period that violence becomes a quiet but constant undercurrent. People who owe money and fail to pay are dealt with harshly. Those suspected of informing are made examples of. But the violence, while brutal, is never chaotic. It is calculated, almost businesslike, a message sent to keep the machinery running smoothly. This period also marks the first time the public begins to hear Christy's name more widely. Journalists covering organized crime begin to write about a new kind of drug boss, one who is more like a multinational CEO than a street gangster. Gardaí warn of the scale of his operations, but there is also a note of begrudging respect. Christy is not easy to catch, and even when caught, he has a way of slipping through legal cracks. It is as though he is always one step ahead. By the mid-1990s, Christy Kinahan has become the undisputed pioneer of Ireland's international drug trade. His network is moving tons of product across borders, his lieutenants are loyal, and his money is flowing faster than ever. Dublin may still be home, but his sights are firmly set on Europe. The scale of his operations now demands a base of operations that is outside Irish jurisdiction, somewhere where he can move freely and meet with other power players without constant police surveillance. The next phase of his empire, the move to Spain's Costa del Sol, is just on the horizon. The story at this stage feels almost calm, as though the storm has not yet broken. The violence is controlled, the money is steady, the organization is humming like a well-oiled machine. But beneath the surface, tension is building. Every empire attracts rivals. Every kingpin, no matter how careful, eventually draws attention from the wrong people. And Christy knows that sooner or later, someone will challenge him, and that the stakes will be higher than ever. By the late 1990s, Dublin had become a city simmering with tension, and Christy Kinahan's growing network was beginning to attract more than quiet curiosity. In the underworld, nothing stays undisputed forever. The very success that made Christy a kingmaker was also drawing predators, rivals, and opportunists who wanted a piece of the fortune flowing through his hands. The next chapter of his story would no longer be quiet or hidden. It would be written in blood on Dublin streets. Gangland feuds in Ireland were nothing new, but what was coming would be different. These were not neighborhood brawls or drunken standoffs. This was organized war, calculated, relentless, and meant to send a message to anyone who might consider crossing the Kinahan network. The first bodies to fall were not always headline material, low-level dealers, small-time runners who had stolen from the wrong shipment, or mid-tier rivals who refused to pay their debts. But each death was a signal, a whisper that traveled through the estates like electricity. The message was simple: the Kinahans were not to be trifled with. Picture a rainy Dublin evening. The narrow streets glisten with puddles under the street lamps, and somewhere, a car engine idles quietly. Inside, a man waits, nerves on edge, hands clenched on the steering wheel. He is not just waiting, he is hunting. A rival steps out of a pub, pulls his coat tighter against the drizzle, and begins the short walk to his car. There is a pause, a deep breath, and then gunfire. The sound is deafening in the narrow lane, echoing off brick walls. When the shooter speeds away, silence returns, broken only by the rain and the shouts of bystanders. Another message has been delivered. For Christy, these killings were not random acts of vengeance. They were part of a cold calculus, a way to maintain order, remove threats, and show strength. He had learned early that hesitation could be fatal in this business. If someone took from him and was allowed to live, others would follow. Discipline had to be absolute, and discipline was often enforced with bullets. The Irish media began to take notice, splashing headlines about gangland killings across the front pages. Journalists spoke of a new level of professionalism in these murders: clean jobs, carefully planned, often carried out in broad daylight with chilling precision. The public was horrified, but in some ways morbidly fascinated. Dublin, once thought of as a quiet European capital, was beginning to look like the set of a mafia film. Law enforcement, too, began to focus more intently on Christie's operations. The Gardaí launched major investigations, assigning detectives to follow his lieutenants, tapping phones, and raiding stash houses. Some arrests were made, but the heart of the operation remained frustratingly out of reach. Christy was careful, often several steps removed from the violence he ordered. He rarely left a paper trail, and when questioned, he was calm, polite, and maddeningly unshakable. To the public, this only added to his mystique. To the police, it made him the top priority. But violence has a way of spiraling beyond even the control of those who unleash it. As the killings mounted, rival groups struck back. Drive-by shootings, ambushes, and even bomb attacks began to punctuate Dublin's underworld life. Families who had nothing to do with the drug trade lived in fear, knowing that a feud could erupt on their street at any time. There was a sense that the city was holding its breath, waiting for the next explosion of gunfire. Christy understood that survival in this environment required more than just firepower, it required alliances. He began forging deeper ties with other criminal organizations abroad, particularly in Spain, where the Costa del Sol had become a haven for fugitives and smugglers. This was a clever move. Operating from Spain allowed him to direct operations in Ireland while remaining out of immediate reach of Irish authorities. It also gave him access to a wider pool of suppliers, mercenaries, and logistics experts who could keep his empire running even as the streets of Dublin grew more dangerous. It is worth pausing here and imagining the psychological toll this period must have taken. Christy was a calculating man, but even he could not be immune to the weight of constant war. Each phone call could bring news of another death, a friend, an associate, perhaps even someone close to the family. The paranoia must have been constant. Was the next shot meant for him? Would the next raid uncover something that could not be denied? And yet, if he felt fear, he did not show it. His composure remained his greatest weapon, the calm at the center of the storm. For the public, these years turned Dublin into a city where crime became impossible to ignore. Tabloids reported the latest killings with grim regularity. Television crews filmed police cordons and forensic teams combing crime scenes under floodlights. Ordinary citizens locked their doors earlier, stayed off certain streets, and whispered about which neighborhoods were Kinahan territory. The underworld, once hidden in the shadows, was now casting a long, unmistakable shadow over the entire city. And yet, for all the bloodshed, Christie's power did not weaken. If anything, it consolidated. Rivals who survived often chose to make peace rather than risk annihilation. Those who joined the Kinahan network found security, at least for as long as they remained loyal. The empire was becoming stronger, more resilient, and more feared than ever. The quiet criminal strategist from Dublin had now become the general of a war, and he was winning. But wars never end cleanly. Each feud sows the seeds for the next. Each killing creates brothers, cousins, and friends hungry for revenge. The cycle of blood would continue, growing more brutal with each turn. And as Christy's sons grew older, especially Daniel, they would inherit not just the wealth of the empire but also its enemies. The next generation was preparing to step into the light, and with them would come an even deadlier chapter, one that would explode into the international spotlight and change Irish organized crime forever. Daniel Kinahan was born into a world already in motion, a world of whispered phone calls, quiet meetings, and a father who was always thinking 3 steps ahead. To outsiders, he might have seemed like just another Dublin boy, but those who knew him understood he carried the weight of something larger. From an early age, Daniel lived in the shadow of Christy Kinahan, the man whose name was spoken in hushed tones across Ireland's criminal underworld. That shadow was not a burden at first, it was a source of fascination. Young Daniel watched, listened, and absorbed. He was growing up in the orbit of a man who was quietly becoming one of Europe's most powerful crime figures, and whether he realized it or not, he was being groomed for a future few could imagine. Daniel's childhood was marked by the same working-class Dublin backdrop that had shaped his father. Grey streets, crowded estates, the sound of football matches echoing between blocks. But there was also an unusual edge to his upbringing. He saw more than most children did, the sudden disappearances of certain men from the neighborhood, the careful way his father spoke on the phone, the visitors who arrived at odd hours and left quickly. These details became part of his education. Where other boys might have been learning multiplication tables, Daniel was learning about loyalty, discretion, and the importance of keeping one's mouth shut. As a teenager, Daniel was intelligent and charismatic. He had a knack for reading people, for knowing who could be trusted and who could not. Teachers sometimes described him as bright but distracted, as though his mind was elsewhere, already calculating futures beyond the classroom walls. There was a confidence about him, the kind that comes from knowing there is a powerful figure standing behind you. He was not reckless, but there was a certain fearlessness, an understanding that he was destined for more than an ordinary life. By the time Daniel reached adulthood, Christy's empire had grown to international proportions, and this gave Daniel access to a world few young Irishmen had ever seen. He traveled, met influential figures, and began to cultivate contacts of his own. While his father's style was quiet and understated, Daniel's approach carried a different energy. He had a taste for the high life, expensive clothes, fast cars, and social circles that mixed gangland figures with sports stars and celebrities. Where Christy preferred to operate from the shadows, Daniel seemed more willing to step closer to the spotlight, to shape his image as not just a crime figure but a businessman, a negotiator, even a patron of sport. It was during this period that Daniel's personality began to shape the future of the Kinahan operation. He was not merely content to inherit what his father had built, he wanted to expand it, to make it something bigger, more sophisticated, more global. He recognized that power in the modern age wasn't just about violence, it was about influence. And influence could be bought, cultivated, and displayed in clever ways. Boxing, in particular, fascinated him. It was a sport with deep roots in Irish culture, one that drew massive crowds and offered enormous potential for money laundering, networking, and image building. In the boxing world, Daniel found a place where he could step into public view while still keeping one foot firmly in the shadows. But before he became a power broker in boxing, Daniel had to prove himself within the cartel. Being the son of Christy Kinahan was not enough, he had to show that he could lead, that he could command respect from hardened men who had risked their lives for the family name. And so Daniel began taking on more responsibility, overseeing shipments, managing negotiations, and making difficult decisions when loyalty faltered. Each successful operation, each deal that went through without a hitch, added to his reputation. Slowly, the lieutenants began to look to him not just as Christy's son but as a leader in his own right. This was also a time when Daniel's ruthlessness began to show. He understood that kindness could be mistaken for weakness, and weakness could get a man killed. When problems arose, Daniel acted decisively. Sometimes brutally. Associates who betrayed the organization were removed, often in ways that sent a clear message to anyone else thinking of disloyalty. The young man who had once stood in his father's shadow was now casting a shadow of his own. Yet there was also a charm to Daniel that made him dangerous in a different way. He could sit across from a fighter, a promoter, or even a journalist and disarm them with an easy smile, a calm voice, and the air of a man who was completely in control. This combination of charm and menace became his signature style. People who met him often remarked that he seemed more like a businessman than a gangster, polite, well-spoken, even likable, but beneath that exterior was a will of steel. For Christy, this must have been a moment of pride. The empire he had built was not going to end with him. His son was ready to carry the torch, to take what had been forged in blood and secrecy and elevate it to something even more formidable. But there must also have been a flicker of worry. Daniel's willingness to operate closer to the public eye carried risks Christy had always avoided. Power attracts attention, and attention attracts law enforcement, journalists, and enemies. As the new millennium approached, Daniel Kinahan was poised to become more than just the heir to Ireland's most powerful cartel. He was about to become its face, the man who would take the Kinahan name out of Dublin streets and into international headlines. The quiet foundation laid by Christy was now ready for expansion, and Daniel had the ambition, the charisma, and the ruthlessness to make it happen. What no one could have predicted was just how far he would take it, or how violently the world would react when he did. The move to Spain's Costa del Sol was more than just a change of scenery for the Kinahans, it was a declaration that their ambitions had outgrown the narrow streets of Dublin. The Costa del Sol, with its sun-washed beaches, luxury villas, and cosmopolitan nightlife, had long been known as the Costa del Crime, a haven for fugitives and gangsters from across Europe. For Christy and Daniel, it was the perfect base: warm weather, discreet banks, and a criminal community that understood the rules of keeping quiet. Picture the scene: the Mediterranean glittering under a late afternoon sun, palm trees swaying, expensive cars parked outside gleaming white villas. Somewhere behind one of those wrought iron gates, a meeting is taking place, not in a smoky backroom but on a sunlit terrace with glasses of wine on the table. Christy sits back, calm as always, while Daniel leans forward, full of energy, outlining new routes, new contacts, new opportunities. Here, far from the watchful eyes of the Irish Gardaí, the Kinahans could breathe, plan, and expand without constant police raids disrupting their operations. Spain offered more than safety. It offered connections. The Costa del Sol was a crossroads where British gangsters, Dutch brokers, Moroccan hashish suppliers, and Colombian cocaine traffickers all mingled. The Kinahans quickly became major players in this underworld network. They built relationships with cartels in South America, ensuring direct access to cocaine shipments that would eventually flood Ireland and the UK. This move allowed them to cut out middlemen, increasing profits and control. But the Kinahans did not simply hide away. They lived well, and their lifestyle began to reflect the wealth that was flowing in. Daniel, especially, embraced the glamour of Spain. He was often seen in fashionable restaurants, mingling with figures from both the criminal world and the boxing scene. For him, Spain was not just a hideout but a stage on which to craft the next act of his life, one where he would not just inherit an empire, but shape its identity. The Spanish years also allowed the Kinahan operation to professionalize. They began to function less like a gang and more like a corporation. There were layers of management, trusted lieutenants who handled logistics, and specialists who laundered money through property deals, front businesses, and offshore accounts. The cartel became harder to infiltrate and even harder to dismantle. Law enforcement agencies across Europe knew who they were but struggled to keep pace with their sophisticated methods. Even so, danger was never far away. The Irish gangland feuds did not disappear just because the Kinahans had changed their address. Rivals traveled to Spain as well, sometimes bringing violence with them. There were assassination attempts, tense encounters in bars, and warnings passed through intermediaries. The Costa del Sol might have been beautiful, but beneath the sun-soaked surface, it was a place where grudges could explode without warning. It was during these years that Daniel's influence began to eclipse that of his father. Christy remained the respected patriarch, the quiet strategist, but Daniel was the one out front, making deals and forging alliances. He was becoming the public face of the operation, and that visibility, though risky, gave him power. Associates and rivals alike began to treat him as the de facto leader, the man who would decide the future direction of the cartel. One can imagine the family gatherings at their Spanish villas, evenings spent around long tables, the air warm, glasses clinking, conversations mixing business with family matters. These were moments of consolidation, where plans were made for new ventures, where enemies were discussed, where decisions that would affect the streets of Dublin were taken under the Andalusian moonlight. The Spanish authorities were not blind to what was happening. They kept the Kinahans under surveillance, occasionally seizing shipments or raiding safe houses. But the cartel had become adept at staying one step ahead. They used burner phones, encrypted messages, and coded language. Even when a case was built, convictions were hard to secure. The Kinahans were careful, disciplined, and patient, qualities that kept them thriving even as other gangs collapsed under pressure. For the public, these years added to the mystique of the Kinahan family. Newspaper articles referred to Christy as the Dapper Don, describing his sharp suits and quiet sophistication. Daniel's name began appearing more frequently, often linked to glamorous images of Marbella or reports of meetings with international boxing figures. To many, he seemed to be walking a fine line between legitimate businessman and shadowy crime boss, a line he would later cross more openly when he stepped fully into the boxing world. But Spain was not just about glamour. It was also about survival. The Kinahans were consolidating their empire at a time when law enforcement across Europe was becoming more coordinated. Europol and Interpol were sharing intelligence, and international task forces were being set up to dismantle large trafficking networks. The Kinahans' move to Spain was both a gamble and a shield. It gave them access to shipping routes and suppliers, but it also put them in a spotlight that was becoming harder to avoid. And yet, for a while, it seemed to work. The money flowed, the cartel grew, and the Kinahan name became synonymous with power not just in Dublin but across the continent. It was a golden period, at least for those inside the organization, a time when the dream of building a global criminal dynasty seemed within reach. But golden periods never last forever. Beneath the calm surface of the Mediterranean, storms were gathering. Rival factions were plotting revenge for old feuds, and law enforcement was tightening its net. The next act in the Kinahan saga would not be played out in quiet meetings or sunny terraces. It would be loud, bloody, and impossible to ignore. The violence that had always been an undercurrent was about to spill over once again, this time in a way that would shock Ireland and the world. By the early 2010s, the Costa del Sol was no longer just a base of operations for the Kinahans, it was the nerve center of a global empire. The money was flowing. The connections were solid, and Daniel Kinahan had firmly established himself as the face of the organization. But with growth came exposure, and with exposure came enemies who were no longer content to grumble from the shadows. Old tensions in Dublin were reigniting, and the first sparks of a feud that would leave bodies scattered across two countries were beginning to fly. The Hutch family had been a fixture in Dublin's criminal landscape for decades. Jerry, the monk, Hutch was one of the most cunning figures the city had ever produced, calm, calculating, and famously disciplined, much like Christy Kinahan himself. For years, there had been a wary respect between the two sides. They shared contacts, occasionally did business, and generally stayed out of each other's way. But as the Kinahans grew more powerful and more international, lines began to blur. Business deals soured. Trusted lieutenants switched sides. Money went missing. And in the criminal underworld, missing money is rarely forgiven. It started, as gangland wars often do, with a single killing. Gary Hutch, a nephew of Jerry Hutch, was gunned down on the Costa del Sol in 2015. The murder was brutal and precise, a clear message that the fragile peace between the two factions was over. The Kinahans believed Gary had betrayed them, that he had played a part in a plot against Daniel's life. Whether that was true or not almost didn't matter. The killing was meant to reassert control, to show that betrayal, real or perceived, would be punished without hesitation. But the Hutch family was not the type to let such a murder go unanswered. Retaliation was inevitable. Dublin became a city on edge, with both sides mobilizing their networks. Gunmen were brought in from abroad, safe houses were stocked with weapons, and whispers began to circulate that something big was coming. Detectives in the Gardaí could feel it too, the calm before the storm. They increased surveillance, stepped up patrols, but even they knew that when two empires collide, no amount of policing can stop the blood that's about to be spilled. The violence escalated quickly. Drive-by shootings, attempted assassinations, and botched hits turned the streets into battlegrounds. Each attack was followed by another, like moves in a deadly chess game. Men were shot outside their homes, ambushed in cars, even gunned down while sitting with their families. Each death was a message, not just to the other side, but to the entire city. Dublin hadn't seen gangland violence on this scale since the height of the heroin epidemic, and the public watched in shock as the body count climbed. Imagine the atmosphere in Dublin at this time. Neighborhoods once filled with children playing football now felt like war zones. Residents learned to duck at the sound of motorbikes, knowing that shooters often struck from the back of one. Mothers walked their children to school with a nervous glance over their shoulders. The city was gripped by a low hum of fear, the kind that seeps into everyday life until it becomes normal. And through it all, Daniel Kinahan was becoming an even more polarizing figure. To his supporters and associates, he was a man defending his family's honor, protecting what they had built. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a man who had let ambition turn him into a warmonger. The press began writing about him with increasing intensity, naming him in connection with the feud, describing him as the mastermind, pulling the strings from his base in Spain. His image was no longer just that of a businessman dabbling in boxing, it was that of a crime lord overseeing a war. The Gardaí poured resources into trying to stop the bloodshed, but the feud seemed to have a momentum of its own. Every arrest led to new replacements, every seizure of weapons was followed by another shipment arriving from abroad. The Hutch-Kinahan War was becoming one of the deadliest feuds in Irish history, and there was no sign of it slowing down. Inside the Kinahan organization, the pressure must have been immense. Daniel was juggling not just the logistics of a global drug empire, but the day-to-day demands of a gang war. Each decision carried life-or-death consequences. Who should be targeted next? Who could still be trusted? Which safe houses were compromised? Paranoia crept in like fog, and even trusted allies were watched closely for signs of betrayal. Spain was no safer. The Hutch faction had allies there too, and Daniel had to move carefully, knowing that any slip in security could be fatal. Bodyguards became a constant presence. Villas were fortified. Meetings were conducted with increasing secrecy. The glamorous image of Marbella life was still there, the luxury cars, the sunny terraces, but beneath it all was tension so thick it could be felt in the air. Each killing brought the cycle closer to a breaking point. The Gardaí warned that the violence was escalating beyond anyone's control, and they were right. Something dramatic would have to happen to shift the balance, something that would make the world sit up and take notice. And soon, that moment would come. All of this tension, all of this bloodshed, was leading toward one shocking event that would change the feud forever, an attack so brazen, so public, that it would make international headlines and turn Daniel Kinahan from a shadowy underworld figure into one of the most wanted men in Europe. For now, the stage was set. The pieces were in motion. Dublin was a city gripped by fear, Spain was a city of watchful eyes, and the Kinahan-Hutch feud had become a storm gathering on the horizon. Everyone knew that the next move would be the most dangerous yet, and when it came, it would shake the Irish underworld to its core. The morning of February 5, 2016, dawned cold and pale over Dublin. For most of the city, it was just another day. Commuters bustled to work, schoolchildren zipped up coats against the wind, and the hum of everyday life carried on as it always did. But at the Regency Hotel, on the city's north side, a different kind of day was beginning, one that would leave an indelible scar on Ireland's criminal history. Inside the hotel, there was a buzz of excitement. It was weigh-in day for a major boxing event, a fight night that had drawn promoters, fighters, journalists, and fans. The weigh-in room was crowded, cameras flashing as fighters stepped on the scales, reporters jotting down notes, and boxing fans murmuring about who looked ready, who looked weak. Among those present was Daniel Kinahan, who had been deeply involved in organizing the fight card through his boxing connections. For him, this was supposed to be a moment of celebration, another step in his campaign to transform boxing into a legitimate empire-building tool. The atmosphere was almost festive, but beneath it all, tension lingered. Everyone in the Irish underworld knew the feud between the Kinahans and the Hutches was reaching a boiling point. Security was on alert, and there were whispers that Daniel was being watched closely. No one could have guessed just how brazen the next move would be. Sometime after 2 p.m., the first gunmen arrived. They were dressed as Gardaí, Irish police, in full tactical gear, complete with helmets and assault rifles. To an untrained eye, they looked official, but their presence inside the hotel was not to protect anyone. It was to kill. Witnesses would later recall the surreal moment when they stormed through the doors, the black-clad figures shouting, the sudden screams, the stampede as people dove for cover. The gunmen moved with terrifying precision. They were not there to spray bullets at random, they were there for a specific target. As panic rippled through the room, they opened fire. Bullets tore into the walls, the ceiling, the air itself seemed to shake with the noise. Daniel Kinahan was reportedly the intended target, but fate, timing, or sheer luck meant that he managed to escape the hail of gunfire. Not everyone was so fortunate. David Byrne, a known Kinahan associate, was shot dead in the attack. The killing was quick, brutal, and shocking not just because of where it happened, but because of how it happened, in broad daylight, in a crowded hotel, in front of journalists and cameras. The audacity of it sent shivers through the entire country. This was not just gangland business. This was open warfare. Picture the scene in the moments after, the smell of gunpowder lingering in the air, the ringing in everyone's ears from the deafening gunfire, the shocked silence broken only by sobbing and shouts for help. People crawled out from under tables, some still clutching their phones, others too stunned to speak. Journalists who had come to cover a sports story suddenly found themselves in the middle of a massacre. Their photos, some of which captured the gunmen in mid-attack, would soon appear on every front page in Ireland. The Gardaí descended on the hotel within minutes, sealing off the area, interviewing witnesses, and collecting evidence. The scale of the response reflected the gravity of the crime. This was not just another gangland hit. This was an escalation unlike anything Ireland had seen in decades. The message from the Hutch faction was unmistakable: they could strike anywhere, even in public, even in front of the cameras. For Daniel Kinahan, the attack was a narrow escape, but also a devastating blow. One of his closest allies had been killed, and the illusion of control he had carefully built was shattered. He was now not just a figure in the underworld but the face of a feud that had spilled out into the open. The press coverage was relentless, painting him as the man at the center of a gangland war that was spiraling out of control. The impact on the boxing world was immediate and profound. Promoters, fighters, and fans were horrified. The idea that an organized hit could take place at a weigh-in shook the sport to its core. Some fighters refused to compete, events were cancelled, and the connection between boxing and organized crime was suddenly the subject of global headlines. Daniel's dream of using boxing as a pathway to legitimacy was now entangled with images of blood-stained hotel floors and terrified spectators running for their lives. The days that followed felt almost cinematic in their intensity. Gardaí launched one of the largest investigations in modern Irish history, raiding homes, seizing vehicles, and putting suspected associates under heavy surveillance. Armed checkpoints appeared on Dublin streets, and police presence was visible everywhere. The Hutch faction went to ground, knowing that retaliation was inevitable. And retaliate the Kinahans did. In the weeks and months that followed, a string of murders swept through Dublin and beyond, targeting Hutch associates and anyone suspected of aiding them. Each killing was carried out with chilling efficiency, men shot while sitting in cars, while answering doors, even while attending funerals. It became clear that the Kinahan response would be relentless, and that the feud had entered a phase from which there was no easy return. For ordinary Dubliners, the Regency Hotel shooting marked a turning point. The feud was no longer something that happened in dark alleys or quiet suburbs. It was now something that could erupt in public, in front of cameras, in places where families gathered. Fear became part of daily life. Parents worried about being caught in crossfire while shopping. Local businesses worried about being associated with one side or the other. And yet, there was also a strange, uneasy fascination. Newspapers sold out quickly when they carried updates on the feud. People whispered in pubs about who might be next, which side had the upper hand, and how long it would be before the next headline-grabbing attack. The feud had become a grim spectacle, one that seemed to pull the entire nation into its orbit. For Daniel, the Regency attack would define the next stage of his life. He could no longer claim to be a shadowy businessman quietly involved in boxing. His name was now synonymous with one of the most notorious criminal events in Irish history. The world was watching, law enforcement was closing in, and the blood feud that had claimed David Byrne would continue to claim lives for years to come. The attack had done more than kill one man, it had changed the entire landscape of Irish organized crime. The Hutch-Kinahan War was no longer a hidden conflict. It was a public war, fought in front of cameras, chronicled in daily news updates, and followed by an anxious nation. The only question left was how far it would go, and how high the body count would climb before someone finally called it to an end. In the days following the Regency Hotel shooting, Dublin felt different, quieter, heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Police tape still fluttered outside the hotel, now a crime scene. Forensics teams worked methodically, combing through every inch of carpet, every bullet casing, every security camera recording. The smell of gunpowder had long since faded, but the memory of the gunfire still lingered in the air, like an echo no one could quite shake. Then came the headlines. Almost overnight, every major newspaper, every television station, and every radio program in Ireland was leading with the same story, the brazen attack at the Regency Hotel. Front pages carried dramatic photographs of the gunmen in fake Garda uniforms, rifles in hand, their faces obscured. Other images showed terrified boxing fans running for their lives, fighters cowering behind tables, Gardaí ushering people to safety. The shocking visuals were replayed again and again, burned into the public's mind. And one name began to appear everywhere, Daniel Kinahan. Journalists who had followed organized crime for years now had a story too big to ignore. They began connecting dots for the public, explaining who the Kinahans were, how Daniel had risen to prominence, and why this feud with the Hutch family had exploded into open warfare. Long investigative pieces appeared, detailing the cartel's operations, its international reach, its links to Spain, Dubai, and beyond. For many Irish citizens, this was the first time they had heard Daniel Kinahan's name, and it was suddenly impossible to escape it. In living rooms across Ireland, families watched evening news segments with a mix of fear and fascination. The calm-voiced anchors described Daniel as the most dangerous man in Ireland, a figure at the center of a criminal war that had already claimed multiple lives. Some shows brought in former Garda detectives, boxing promoters, and crime journalists to discuss the implications. Was Daniel really the mastermind of a cartel? Could the Gardaí bring him to justice? Was Dublin now living through its own version of the mafia wars once seen in New York or Sicily? For Daniel, the media storm was a nightmare, and, paradoxically, a confirmation of his power. Until now, he had been a figure who could move quietly, building connections in the boxing world, forging deals in Spain, staying just out of reach of law enforcement. But the Regency shooting changed that forever. His face was now in the papers. His name was being debated in Parliament. He had become a household name, not as a promoter or businessman, but as the alleged head of a criminal organization locked in a war with the Hutches. The coverage was relentless. Reporters staked out airports, boxing gyms, and courthouses, trying to catch any associate who might be willing to talk. Tabloids ran splashy stories, speculating on Daniel's whereabouts, his personal life, his wealth. Photos of luxury villas in Marbella, expensive cars, and security convoys appeared under bold headlines. Some papers even published maps charting the body count of the feud, marking each shooting on Dublin's map like grim points of reference. And yet, despite the coverage, Daniel himself seemed to vanish. There were no public statements, no interviews, no appearances. The man at the center of the storm became more elusive than ever, operating from a distance, rumored to be moving between Spain and Dubai. This only deepened the sense of mystery, and for many, fear. It was one thing to know who the enemy was, it was another to know that he was out there somewhere, untouchable, beyond the reach of Irish law. The Gardaí, for their part, used the media attention to send their own message. High-ranking officers gave press conferences promising to end the feud, vowing that no one was above the law. Armed checkpoints were set up around Dublin, targeting gangland figures. There were raids, arrests, and seizures of weapons and drugs. Each successful operation was announced publicly, part of a campaign to reassure the public that the state was still in control. But the truth was more complicated. Every time there was a lull, another killing seemed to erupt, pulling the city back into fear. And every time a new body fell, the media returned, updating the tally, repeating Daniel's name. In some ways, the coverage turned him into a mythic figure, part villain, part untouchable mastermind. For younger men in certain neighborhoods, that notoriety was intoxicating. To them, Daniel represented power, wealth, and the ability to rise above poverty. For others, he represented everything wrong with Dublin, the violence, the drugs, the shattered families. Boxing, too, felt the impact of the media storm. Promoters who had once worked with Daniel suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Fighters were asked about him in press conferences, forced to choose their words carefully. Some distanced themselves publicly, while others refused to speak on the matter at all. It was as if Daniel's name had become radioactive, too dangerous to say aloud, but too big to ignore. Meanwhile, the Hutch family and their allies were not silent. Through leaks, through whispers, through carefully placed messages, they too made their presence felt. The feud had spilled out of the shadows and into the court of public opinion. Ordinary citizens found themselves debating it in pubs and cafes. Who was to blame? Would the killings ever stop? Was Daniel as powerful as the papers said, or was he just another gangster with a target on his back? For Daniel himself, this period must have been both empowering and deeply unsettling. He had achieved a kind of infamy that few gangland figures ever reach. His name was now known on every street in Ireland. But with fame came heat. Every move was being watched, every phone call potentially monitored, every ally a potential liability. The media had turned him into a symbol, and symbols are hard to hide. As the weeks turned to months, the Regency shooting faded from the headlines, but Daniel's name did not. It lingered, attached to every new killing, every new police operation, every new rumor. He was no longer just a man. He was the face of a war, the embodiment of a conflict that showed no sign of ending. The city of Dublin, too, had changed. There was a sense of unease that hung in the air, a fear that the next attack could come anywhere, at any time. Families avoided certain neighborhoods, boxing fans stayed away from events, and journalists kept writing, knowing that the story was far from over. The storm had begun at the Regency Hotel, but now it was everywhere, on every screen, in every conversation, in every quiet glance exchanged on the streets. And at the center of it all was Daniel Kinahan, a man who had wanted to build a global empire, but who had now become something he could never fully control, a public enemy. In the wake of the Regency Hotel attack and the media frenzy that followed, Daniel Kinahan faced a choice: retreat deeper into the shadows or step forward into a new role, one that could offer both power and protection. He chose the latter, and the stage he picked was the boxing world. For years, Daniel had been fascinated by the sport. Boxing was not just entertainment for him, it was a business opportunity and, perhaps more importantly, a chance to rebrand himself. The sport had always carried an undercurrent of danger and glamour, a place where tough men fought for glory under bright lights. For someone like Daniel, it was also the perfect place to wield influence without needing to appear as a gangster. Picture the scene: a luxury gym in Marbella, the air smelling faintly of sweat and leather. The sound of gloves hitting pads echoes through the room as a heavyweight champion trains in the corner. And there, quietly observing, is Daniel Kinahan, not in tracksuits or gaudy gold chains, but in smart casual clothes, calm and smiling, shaking hands with promoters and managers. To an outsider, he might look like just another successful businessman, someone helping fighters get the deals they deserve. Daniel began positioning himself as a key figure behind the scenes, guiding fighters' careers, brokering major matches, and earning a reputation as someone who could make big fights happen. He co-founded MTK Global, a management company that quickly became a powerhouse in the sport. Under his guidance, fighters who had once struggled to get opportunities were suddenly landing high-profile bouts and lucrative contracts. For the fighters themselves, Daniel was a savior, someone who could navigate the politics of boxing and deliver results. But Daniel was not content with managing up-and-coming fighters. His ambitions were much bigger. Soon, he was brokering deals for some of the sport's biggest names, including Tyson Fury, the charismatic heavyweight champion who would become one of the most dominant figures in modern boxing. It was Daniel who reportedly played a key role in negotiating the blockbuster unification fight between Fury and Anthony Joshua, about that promised to be one of the richest in boxing history. For Daniel, these moves served several purposes. They elevated his status within the boxing community, gave him a seat at the table in one of the most lucrative sports in the world, and, crucially, helped craft a narrative that he was a legitimate businessman, not just a crime boss. The images of him posing with fighters, shaking hands with promoters, and smiling for cameras painted a very different picture than the headlines screaming about gangland feuds. But not everyone was convinced. Law enforcement agencies watched closely, warning that Daniel's involvement in boxing was a way to launder money and expand his influence. Journalists continued to write investigative pieces linking him to the Kinahan Cartel, arguing that his presence in the sport threatened to tarnish its reputation. Promoters and broadcasters faced uncomfortable questions about whether they were willing to do business with someone alleged to be at the center of organized crime. Still, the boxing world was hard to resist. The sport had always had a complicated relationship with the underworld, from the days of mob-controlled fights in mid-20th century America to the shadowy figures who brokered bouts behind closed doors. Daniel was simply the latest in a long line of powerful backroom operators, and as long as the money flowed and the fights sold tickets, many were willing to look the other way. For the fighters themselves, Daniel's support could be life-changing. He was known to be generous, sometimes covering training expenses, arranging travel, and ensuring that fighters were paid fairly. This earned him loyalty, even admiration. To many of them, he wasn't a cartel boss, he was the man who gave them a chance at greatness. Imagine the atmosphere at one of those press events, cameras flashing, fans cheering, and at the center of it all, a fighter declaring that his future had been secured thanks to the efforts of my advisor, Daniel. For a moment, the weight of the feud, the bloodshed, and the headlines faded into the background. In those arenas, under the bright lights, Daniel was not a fugitive, he was a kingmaker. Yet, there was always a shadow following him. Every time his name appeared in a press release or was mentioned on television, there were immediate questions. Sports journalists began including disclaimers: reminding audiences that Daniel had been named in Irish courts as the head of an organized crime group. Politicians called for boxing to cut ties with him. Even as he tried to reinvent himself, the past refused to let go. The tension between Daniel's two identities, the alleged cartel boss and the boxing promoter, became part of the narrative. To some, he was living proof that a man could escape the streets and reinvent himself on the global stage. To others, he was using the sport as a shield, a way to sanitize his image while continuing to run a criminal empire behind the scenes. For Daniel, this period must have been both exhilarating and exhausting. On one hand, he was achieving a dream, sitting at the top of the boxing world, influencing the biggest fights on the planet, building relationships with sports stars and television networks. On the other hand, every victory brought more scrutiny, more headlines, more pressure from law enforcement. It was a delicate balancing act, and one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. Still, Daniel pressed forward. The bigger the fights, the more power he held. The more power he held, the more impossible it became to ignore him, and the harder it became for anyone to pretend that boxing had not been touched by the feud that had once stained the carpets of the Regency Hotel red. As the cameras flashed and the contracts were signed, one thing became clear: Daniel Kinahan had managed to do something extraordinary. He had taken the Kinahan name from the alleyways of Dublin to the global stage of professional boxing. But in doing so, he had also ensured that when the world came looking for him, and it inevitably would, they would not just find a gangster. They would find a man who had built an empire, one foot in the shadows, the other under the blinding lights of the ring. Once Daniel Kinahan had established himself as a key figure in boxing, his influence began to grow in ways that few could ignore. The sport is a world built on networks, promoters, managers, fighters, broadcasters, and Daniel had a rare ability to connect them all. Where others saw red tape and endless negotiations, he saw opportunity. He became known as the man who could make fights happen, even fights that promoters had spent years trying to arrange. Behind closed doors, Daniel's meetings were quiet, deliberate, and businesslike. There were no raised voices, no threats. Associates describe him as calm, patient, and persuasive, a man who understood that in boxing, relationships were as important as contracts. He had learned from his father's way of operating: control was not achieved by shouting orders, but by making yourself indispensable. Soon, fighters across multiple weight classes were signing with MTK Global, the company he had co-founded, and Daniel's reach extended from small local gyms to some of the biggest arenas in the world. Imagine a boardroom in London or Dubai, promoters sitting around a polished table, phones buzzing with calls from broadcasters, while Daniel speaks quietly, outlining terms. He had a knack for presenting deals as mutually beneficial, ensuring that everyone involved, the fighters, the promoters, the television networks, felt they were getting what they wanted. But beneath that surface diplomacy was a clear reality: Daniel was becoming a gatekeeper. If you wanted the biggest fights, you had to deal with him. For fighters, this was often a blessing. Many had spent years struggling to break through, fighting in small venues for small purses. Daniel changed that. Under his guidance, fights were booked on bigger stages, purses grew, and careers accelerated. Some fighters called him a genius, someone who truly cared about their future. They praised his ability to secure fair pay and get deals across the finish line that others had failed to deliver. But for some promoters and rival managers, Daniel's growing influence was a source of unease. They whispered about the shadow hanging over his name, the allegations from law enforcement, the feud that had claimed so many lives back in Dublin. Could a man accused of running a global drug cartel really be allowed to sit at the center of professional boxing? Could the sport maintain its integrity with someone like him pulling strings from behind the scenes? These questions became more urgent as Daniel's influence spread. He was no longer just involved in a few fights here and there, he was shaping entire divisions. Major bouts between top contenders bore his imprint. Broadcast deals worth millions were negotiated with his input. Even world champions publicly thanked him during press conferences, crediting him with making their fights happen. For those inside the sport, it became increasingly difficult to separate boxing's resurgence from Daniel's hand in it. The Irish and British media continued to dig deeper. Long investigative features were published, tracing Daniel's journey from the streets of Dublin to the boardrooms of international boxing. The Gardaí and Europol warned publicly that he was still a key figure in organized crime. Each warning brought renewed scrutiny, but strangely, it did little to slow him down. If anything, it seemed to solidify his reputation as someone untouchable, a man who could operate in plain sight despite the storm swirling around him. There was, too, a certain charisma to the way Daniel handled this scrutiny. He did not give interviews, did not plead his case in public. Instead, he let his work speak for him. Each new deal, each new fight announcement was its own statement, that he was still here, still operating, still building something bigger. For some, this quiet defiance made him even more intriguing. It is easy to imagine the late-night calls, the hushed meetings, the constant calculations that went into maintaining this level of control. Daniel was balancing multiple worlds, the legitimate face of boxing, the shadowy underworld connections, the ongoing feud that still threatened to erupt at any moment. Every decision carried weight, every move had to be perfectly timed. The fighters under his guidance continued to thrive. Titles were won, belts collected, pay-per-view numbers soared. To the fans, boxing seemed to be entering a golden period, with long-awaited matchups finally materializing. Most didn't know, or didn't care, about the man behind the scenes making it happen. For them, the spectacle was enough. And yet, the shadow never went away. Each time a fighter praised Daniel by name, headlines followed. Each time a major fight was announced, journalists reminded readers of who he was alleged to be. The tension between his public image as a boxing advisor and his private reputation as a cartel boss grew sharper with each passing month. At his peak, Daniel Kinahan's influence over boxing was undeniable. He was in the room when the biggest decisions were made. He was the man whose phone calls could change the course of a fighter's career overnight. For those in the sport, he was both respected and feared, a figure who inspired loyalty but also caution. But such power cannot last forever. The higher Daniel climbed, the more attention he drew, not just from journalists, but from governments, police agencies, and even international watchdogs. The very success that made him indispensable to boxing was also painting a target on his back. Investigators were watching closely, compiling evidence, and preparing to make their move. For now, though, Daniel was still at the height of his influence. The empire was strong, the money was flowing, and the world of boxing revolved around his decisions. It was, in many ways, the pinnacle of his public life, but just beyond the horizon, trouble was gathering, and the next phase of his story would be far less forgiving. By the late 2010s, Daniel Kinahan's name was no longer just whispered in gangland pubs or muttered in police briefings. It was on international watch lists, intelligence files, and the desks of some of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. For years, the Gardaí in Ireland had tried to chip away at the Kinahan empire, seizing drugs, arresting low-level associates, disrupting operations where they could. But the cartel had proven resilient, able to absorb losses and keep its business moving. Now, the fight was about to escalate to a whole new level. Behind closed doors, meetings were taking place in Dublin, The Hague, Washington, D.C., and Madrid. Europol, the European Union's law enforcement agency, began coordinating efforts with the Irish Gardaí, Spain's Guardia Civil, the UK's National Crime Agency, and the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. The scale of what they were planning was unprecedented, a coordinated strike against one of Europe's most sophisticated organized crime groups. Imagine a quiet conference room in Europol's headquarters in The Hague. Maps are pinned to the walls showing routes of cocaine shipments from South America, heroin pipelines from Asia, and money laundering hubs across Europe and the Middle East. Around the table sit detectives, analysts, and intelligence officers from multiple countries. At the center of their discussion is the Kinahan name. They trade information, wiretap transcripts, financial records, surveillance photos from Spain, Dubai, and Ireland. Slowly, patiently, they are building a case that can stand up in court. The operation is painstaking. Cartels like the Kinahans thrive on secrecy, using burner phones, encrypted messaging apps, and layers of middlemen to hide their leaders from direct exposure. But law enforcement is learning to adapt. Cybercrime units crack codes, trace digital fingerprints, follow money trails through shell companies and offshore accounts. Each piece of evidence is another thread in the web, pulling investigators closer to the core. Meanwhile, the Gardaí continue their work on the ground in Dublin. Armed checkpoints are set up around gangland neighborhoods. Known associates are stopped, questioned, sometimes arrested on smaller charges to keep them under pressure. Surveillance units follow cars, take photos from a distance, collect license plates and patterns of movement. The goal is to make life uncomfortable for the cartel, to show that nowhere is truly safe. The DEA brings a different kind of expertise. For decades, they have been fighting cartels in South America, tracing shipments from Colombia and Mexico to the streets of American cities. Now, they lend that same skill set to tracking how cocaine is moving into Europe. Flights, shipping containers, even fishing boats are watched. Every interception is another data point, another proof that the Kinahans are at the center of a network moving billions of euros worth of drugs. There is something cinematic about this phase of the story, the sense of a slow, tightening net. Each country contributes its piece of the puzzle. Spain provides intelligence about meetings in Marbella. The Dutch authorities share details about port seizures in Rotterdam. British investigators follow the money through London banks. Step by step, the case becomes clearer, harder to deny. And yet, Daniel remains out of reach. By now, he is spending more and more time in Dubai, a city of glittering skyscrapers and discreet luxury. There, he lives in a world of high security and private compounds, beyond the direct reach of European arrest warrants. Dubai is a place where money talks, where many fugitives from across the globe have found temporary sanctuary. For Daniel, it is the perfect vantage point, a place where he can continue to run operations, meet with associates, and manage his boxing interests, all while staying just far enough from the grasp of European law enforcement. But even Dubai is not beyond the reach of international pressure. Behind the scenes, diplomats begin pushing for cooperation. The United States takes a particular interest, as the flow of narcotics into Europe increasingly involves the same South American suppliers that the DEA has been battling for decades. American officials know that cutting off the Kinahans would be a blow to the global drug trade, and they are willing to use their influence to make it happen. The press begins to pick up on this growing international manhunt. Articles appear describing Daniel as a global fugitive, an international criminal whose empire spans continents. News programs feature graphics showing the network of routes, the countries involved, the staggering amounts of drugs being moved. For the public, the story becomes bigger than Ireland. This is no longer just a Dublin feud, it is a multinational crime story, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse playing out across Europe and the Middle East. For Daniel and his inner circle, the pressure is mounting. Associates are arrested. Properties are raided. Bank accounts are frozen. Trusted lieutenants begin to fall one by one, either caught by police or targeted by rivals sensing weakness. Inside the cartel, paranoia deepens. Every phone call feels risky, every meeting could be a trap. The fortress that once seemed impenetrable is beginning to show cracks. And yet, the Kinahan network still functions. The drugs still move, the money still flows, the boxing deals still get done. It is a testament to how deeply entrenched the organization has become, a machine that keeps running even as parts of it are being stripped away. In the quiet of the night, one can imagine Daniel reviewing reports from his advisors, weighing his next moves carefully. Does he stay in Dubai, trusting in its protections? Does he shift his base elsewhere, to a place even further from the reach of Western agencies? Or does he double down, strengthening security and continuing to project confidence? For law enforcement, there is no turning back. Too much has been invested, too many agencies involved. The plan is no longer simply to disrupt the cartel, but to dismantle it completely. Arrest warrants are prepared. Sanctions are drafted. The noose is tightening, and everyone knows that the next step will be public, dramatic, and aimed directly at the top. The months after the Regency Hotel attack were some of the bloodiest in Ireland's modern history. What had started as a simmering feud had now erupted into full-blown war, a war fought not in battlefields, but in quiet Dublin suburbs, backstreets, and even busy city intersections. The Hutch family had struck a devastating blow by orchestrating the Regency attack, but the Kinahans were not about to take it lying down. Retaliation would be swift, precise, and unrelenting. In the days immediately following the shooting, Dublin felt as though it had been plunged into a state of siege. Armed Gardaí patrolled gangland neighborhoods, their presence a visible reminder that the state was on high alert. Yet even with checkpoints and raids, there was no way to stop what was coming. The Kinahan organization had a long memory, and for every bullet fired at them, they would fire back twofold. The first major retaliation came just 3 days later. In broad daylight, Eddie Hutch, an older brother of Jerry, the monk, Hutch, was gunned down at his home in Dublin. The attack was clinical, the gunman firing multiple shots before escaping. For many, this killing marked the point of no return. The feud was no longer confined to those directly involved in the drug trade, it was now targeting family members, striking at the very heart of the Hutch clan. Each killing that followed felt like another drumbeat in a war rhythm. Cars were ambushed at traffic lights. Masked men stormed into homes. Shots rang out outside gyms, pubs, and even during quiet family gatherings. Dubliners became used to the sound of sirens at night, the flashing blue lights of Garda vehicles illuminating crime scenes. Forensic tents became a familiar sight on the evening news. The violence spread fear through the city like a chill wind. Ordinary citizens who had no stake in the feud learned to keep their heads down, to avoid certain pubs, to steer clear of particular neighborhoods after dark. Mothers walked their children to school with a quiet dread, scanning the streets for passing motorbikes, the preferred transport of many hired gunmen. The city that had once felt open and vibrant now seemed to carry a shadow at every corner. For the Hutch faction, the Kinahan retaliation was devastating. Associate after associate was taken out, often with brutal efficiency. Some were shot while sitting in cars, others while opening their front doors. In one particularly grim case, a young man was shot dead while attending a wake for another feud victim, a reminder that in this war, not even funerals were safe. The Kinahans, for their part, seemed determined to send a message, that no one could attack them with impunity. The killings were not random but targeted, each one meant to weaken the Hutch network further. It was psychological warfare as much as physical, a campaign designed to make rivals feel hunted, to make them think twice before making another move. The Gardaí were caught in a grim race to prevent further bloodshed. Special operations units were deployed, informants were cultivated, and arrests were made where possible. But every time one plot was foiled, another seemed to spring up in its place. The feud had developed a momentum of its own, a cycle of revenge that no one seemed able to stop. Journalists covering the violence began to call it one of the deadliest gangland wars in Irish history. Body counts were updated regularly, each new number sending a shiver through the public. The tabloids ran splashy front pages, splashing photos of the latest victims, while crime reporters spoke in grim tones about what might come next. Dublin, they warned, was living through its own version of the mafia wars once seen in Chicago or New York. And through it all, Daniel Kinahan's name remained at the center. Though he was safely in Dubai or Spain, his shadow stretched across Dublin. Each killing was attributed to his network, each retaliation seen as another move in the deadly chess match he was playing with Jerry Hutch. For Daniel, this was not just about revenge, it was about survival, about showing the world that the Kinahan organization remained strong despite the Regency attack. Inside the cartel, the atmosphere must have been tense. Every move had to be carefully planned, every trusted lieutenant relied on to execute orders without leaving traces. Paranoia ran deep: who might be passing information to the Gardaí, who might be plotting to switch sides, who might be next on the hit list. Loyalty was no longer just a virtue, it was a matter of life and death. Meanwhile, the Hutch side scrambled to regroup, to protect its remaining members. Some went into hiding, others fled abroad, seeking safety wherever they could find it. Jerry Hutch himself reportedly disappeared from view, moving like a ghost, always one step ahead of the men who wanted him dead and the police who wanted him behind bars. The cycle of killing seemed endless, but eventually, the sheer scale of the bloodshed began to draw even more international attention. Europol and the DEA, already working to dismantle the cartel's drug routes, now had a second incentive: stopping a war that was spilling bodies onto the streets of a European capital. Pressure mounted on Irish authorities to deliver results, to bring charges against the people orchestrating the carnage. And yet, even as the net tightened, the feud showed no sign of burning out. Each side still had soldiers willing to pull the trigger, still had debts to settle, still had pride to defend. Dublin remained on edge, and the ordinary people caught in the middle prayed each night that the next spray of bullets wouldn't land on their street. By the time the feud began to slow, more than a dozen lives had been claimed, and countless more had been scarred forever. The city would never be quite the same. Even when the gunfire stopped, the memory of it lingered, the sound of shots ringing out in quiet neighborhoods, the image of forensic tents glowing under streetlights, the knowledge that the war could flare up again at any time. For Daniel Kinahan, the feud was both a test and a turning point. He had survived the most dangerous phase of his life so far. His enemies had been weakened, his own organization had remained intact, and he had sent a message to the world that the Kinahan name still carried weight. But victory came at a price. The attention of governments, police agencies, and the media was now fully fixed on him. The next phase would not be fought with bullets alone, it would be fought in courts, in diplomatic offices, and in the global financial system. Dubai, a city of glittering skyscrapers, gold-dusted sunsets, and carefully cultivated opulence. For Daniel Kinahan, it became both a fortress and a stage. When he relocated here, it was not merely to escape the blood-soaked streets of Dublin, nor solely to avoid the watchful eyes of Europol and the Gardaí. Dubai offered something else entirely: a place where he could operate in relative safety, maintain a global network, and enjoy a lifestyle that seemed a world away from the rain-slick lanes of Ireland. Imagine the skyline at dusk, the Burj Khalifa towering like a needle into the fading sky, the desert air warm even after sunset. Somewhere among the luxury high-rises, Daniel sits in a penthouse apartment, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city's endless lights. The room is quiet but for the soft hum of air conditioning. His phone buzzes intermittently, updates from Europe, negotiations about upcoming fights, news of law enforcement activity back home. This is the nerve center now, thousands of miles from Dublin, yet still deeply connected to its streets. Dubai offered Daniel something no other city could: discretion paired with luxury. Here, he could move through five-star hotels, high-end restaurants, and private clubs without the constant threat of arrest. The UAE does not have an extradition treaty with Ireland, and that alone gave him a kind of shield. International authorities might issue warrants and sanctions, but in Dubai, Daniel could still attend meetings, host visitors, and conduct business, albeit under tighter security than ever before. And there was plenty of security. The days of walking casually through Dublin markets were long gone. Now Daniel traveled with bodyguards, his movements carefully planned. Villas and apartments were chosen not just for their views but for their privacy and defensibility. Cars were armored, routes were varied, meetings were vetted. The man who had once seemed untouchable was making sure he stayed that way. Yet, this was not merely a hiding place, it was a place to live well. Dubai's lifestyle suited Daniel's evolving persona. The city is built on spectacle, on presenting an image of success, and that fit perfectly with his attempt to transition from feared crime boss to legitimate businessman. Here, He could host dinners with international promoters, meet potential investors, and be photographed in settings that projected power and sophistication rather than menace. For those who visited him, the impression was often the same: Daniel was calm, polite, even charming. He spoke not as a man on the run, but as a man in control. Conversations were about business, about fights being organized, about expansion plans, not about gangland feuds or police investigations. This was the image he wanted to project to the world, that of a serious figure, someone who had left the chaos of the streets behind and was now focused on global enterprises. But beneath the surface, the shadow of the feud still lingered. Associates would arrive from Ireland, bringing news of developments back home, whispering updates about who had been arrested, who had flipped, who had been shot. Decisions still had to be made, loyalties still had to be tested, and orders still had to be given. Dubai may have been a glittering fortress, but it was also a control room from which the Kinahan network was still directed. For law enforcement, Daniel's presence in Dubai was both a frustration and a challenge. They could monitor him, watch his movements through international intelligence sharing, but they could not touch him. Publicly, Irish and European officials began to put pressure on the UAE to act, to consider freezing assets and expelling figures linked to organized crime. Privately, diplomatic conversations were taking place, laying the groundwork for what would later become global sanctions. In the meantime, Daniel's influence in boxing continued. Meetings with fighters and promoters sometimes took place in Dubai hotels, deals were struck over coffee in upscale lobbies, and photographs occasionally surfaced of Daniel with well-known sports figures. Each image reignited the debate back home: should boxing allow itself to be associated with someone accused of running a cartel? Should broadcasters cut ties with fights linked to him? The more Daniel appeared in these settings, the louder the controversy became. And yet, Dubai seemed to insulate him from much of the noise. The city's unique blend of privacy and prestige allowed him to keep living the life of a powerful man, even as the walls outside that desert oasis were slowly closing in. At night, when the city quieted and the lights of the skyscrapers glittered like constellations, one can imagine Daniel sitting with a glass in hand, considering how far he had come. From the council estates of Dublin to this, a skyline view, international connections, and a network that spanned continents. For a man who had once been just another young lad on the streets, this must have felt like victory. But victories can be temporary. Outside Dubai, the storm was building. Europol and the DEA were preparing sanctions that would strike at the heart of the Kinahan financial network. The Irish government was increasing pressure. The media was unrelenting, publishing exposés and investigative reports that kept the Kinahan name on front pages. And for all the calm that Dubai provided, there was always the possibility that safety could be snatched away with the stroke of a pen or the signing of a treaty. For now, though, Daniel was still in control. The empire was still functioning, the money still flowing, and the man at the center still enjoyed a life that seemed almost surreal compared to the chaos he had left behind. The desert had become his sanctuary, a place where he could appear untouchable. But even sanctuaries can turn into cages. The calm that Daniel Kinahan had found in Dubai could not last forever. Beyond the shimmering desert skyline, a storm was gathering, not of bullets this time, but of governments, diplomats, and financial watchdogs aligning their sights on the Kinahan empire. The world was no longer content with letting the feud play out in Dublin or allowing the cartel to quietly run its business abroad. The stage was set for one of the most significant international crackdowns in recent memory. The first strike came in the form of sanctions. In April 2022, the U.S. government announced sweeping measures against Daniel Kinahan, his father Christy, his brother Christopher Jr., and several key associates. The announcement was delivered with the gravity usually reserved for terrorist organizations and rogue regimes. Standing at a podium, senior U.S. officials unveiled the details: a $5 million bounty for information leading to the arrest or conviction of each of the Kinahan leaders, the freezing of assets, and a commitment to work with international partners to dismantle the cartel. The impact was immediate and seismic. For years, Daniel had been able to move relatively freely in Dubai, conducting business and shaping the boxing world from behind the scenes. But sanctions are a different kind of weapon. They do not rely on arrests or extradition. They cut off access to the global financial system, making it almost impossible to move money, pay associates, or invest in legitimate ventures. Banks froze accounts linked to the Kinahan name. Property purchases were halted. Even the luxury lifestyle that Daniel had enjoyed became harder to maintain when every transaction risked drawing scrutiny. Imagine the moment Daniel first heard the news. Perhaps he was sitting in his Dubai apartment, scrolling through reports on a tablet, when the alert came through: the United States Treasury had officially named him a global narco-trafficker. For a man who had carefully cultivated an image of a businessman and promoter, the language was devastating. The U.S. was not just accusing him of crime, it was declaring him a threat on the world stage. International law enforcement agencies quickly followed suit. Europol praised the sanctions, promising to step up cooperation with Irish authorities. The Gardaí held press conferences emphasizing that the noose was tightening, that justice was closer than ever. Spanish authorities, who had long tracked the cartel's movements along the Costa del Sol, began re-examining old cases with renewed vigor. It felt as though every country where the Kinahans had ever done business was suddenly waking up and looking for ways to put pressure on the family. The media exploded with coverage. Front pages showed Daniel's face next to the bold headline, "5 million bounty on Kinahan Cartel." Television broadcasts replayed clips of U.S. officials outlining the rewards program, explaining how anyone with credible information could come forward. Talk radio hosts debated what this meant for the future of Irish organized crime. Was this the end of the Kinahan empire? Could even someone as well connected as Daniel survive when the world's most powerful government had marked him as a target? Inside the boxing world, the ripple effect was immediate. Promoters and broadcasters who had once done business with Daniel began scrambling to distance themselves. MTK Global, the company he co-founded, faced intense scrutiny and eventually announced that Daniel had cut all ties, a statement met with skepticism by many observers. Fighters who had publicly praised him just months before were now carefully sidestepping questions, their media teams instructing them to avoid using his name at all. It was as if a ghost had passed through the sport, erasing all traces of the man who had once been its most influential power broker. The sanctions also had a psychological effect. Associates who had once been fiercely loyal began to worry about their futures. With money harder to move and the promise of multimillion-dollar rewards hanging in the air, the risk of betrayal increased. For law enforcement, this was part of the strategy. Financial isolation and pressure could turn insiders into informants. The walls around Daniel were not just closing in, they were beginning to crumble from the inside. And yet, Daniel remained silent. There were no public statements, no appearances, no interviews. He did not rage against the accusations or try to clear his name. Instead, he retreated deeper into the shadows, maintaining a low profile even as his name dominated headlines. The absence of his voice only deepened the sense of mystery. Was he regrouping? Was he planning a comeback? Or was he simply waiting, hoping that the storm would pass? Dubai, too, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. International pressure mounted on the UAE to take action, to freeze assets and cooperate with global investigations. Though no extradition treaty with Ireland existed, the weight of diplomatic requests could not be ignored forever. For the first time in years, Daniel's position felt less secure. One can imagine him late at night, the city lights glittering below, considering his next move. Should he stay and risk eventual arrest? Should he relocate again, to some place even more remote and insulated from Western reach? Or should he try to strike a deal, to trade information for leniency? Each option carried risk, and the wrong decision could bring everything crashing down. For the Kinahan Cartel, the sanctions were a turning point. Shipments became harder to coordinate, payments were delayed, and rival groups sensed an opportunity to encroach on their territory. The empire that had once seemed unshakable now looked vulnerable. The threat no longer came just from bullets or bombs, it came from frozen bank accounts, legal indictments, and the steady drip of intelligence flowing between agencies. The war had entered a new phase. No longer fought in the streets of Dublin, it was now being waged in financial systems, diplomatic backchannels, and high-security boardrooms. And for Daniel Kinahan, the question was no longer simply whether he could win the feud, it was whether he could keep his freedom. The sanctions had done more than freeze assets and tighten financial nooses, they had changed the conversation around Daniel Kinahan forever. The man who had once been hailed by some fighters as the savior of their careers had now become too dangerous to mention. In a sport where his name had been spoken with gratitude and respect, there was suddenly only silence. The first sign of this shift came in press conferences. Before the sanctions, Daniel's name had been invoked proudly by fighters and managers. "Thanks to Daniel for making this fight happen," was a phrase heard so often that it became a kind of shorthand in the boxing world. But now, when journalists asked about him, fighters hesitated. Their eyes flicked to their PR handlers, their voices softened, and their answers became vague. Some refused to say his name at all, referring only to "my advisor," or "the team." Promoters, too, began to pull away. Companies that had once done business with him quietly severed ties, issuing carefully worded statements about focusing on the sport and respecting the law. Broadcasters asked questions about the optics of airing fights linked to someone named in a U.S. Treasury sanctions list. Sponsors became wary, not wanting their brands associated with controversy. The world of boxing, which had once welcomed Daniel's money and negotiating skills, was now closing its doors. The effect on Daniel's public image was dramatic. Just months earlier, he had been seen as one of the most influential power brokers in the sport, a man who could make or break careers. Now, he was being erased. MTK Global, the management company he co-founded, announced that he had cut all ties, insisting that he no longer had any involvement. Whether the claim was true or not hardly mattered, the gesture was symbolic, an attempt to shield the company from the fallout. Imagine the change in atmosphere at a major fight night. The arenas are still packed, the lights still blinding, the crowd still roaring, but one name is conspicuously absent. The man whose fingerprints were once on every major bout has become a ghost. To speak his name is to invite uncomfortable questions, to risk headlines and investigations. So people stop speaking it. This silence was not just about fear, it was about survival. Those in the boxing business understood that continuing to associate publicly with Daniel could draw the attention of law enforcement or risk losing broadcast deals. The sport had to protect itself, and that meant cutting away the man who had once been at its heart. For Daniel, this must have been a bitter pill to swallow. Boxing had been his passion, his attempt at legitimacy, his way of proving that he could be more than just a name in gangland lore. To see that world turn its back on him was to watch years of work vanish almost overnight. Deals he had brokered were still being carried out, but he was no longer being credited. Fighters he had helped build into champions stopped calling publicly for his guidance. And yet, even as his name was being scrubbed from the sport, the shadow of his presence lingered. Insiders whispered that his influence had not disappeared entirely, that deals were still being shaped by those close to him, that his advice still found its way to fighters behind closed doors. But these whispers were harder to prove now, harder to trace. The man who had once operated half in the open was now forced back into complete invisibility. The media played a major role in this erasure. Each time a fighter or promoter did mention Daniel, articles quickly appeared dissecting the comment, reminding readers of the sanctions, the $5 million bounty, the cartel allegations. Public relations teams took note. Soon, even casual mentions of Daniel were scrubbed from interviews. Fighters were coached to steer conversations elsewhere, to talk about training camps, opponents, anything but the man whose shadow still loomed over their careers. This gradual distancing had a psychological impact. For years, Daniel had been the architect of big nights, the man who called the shots. Now, he was watching from afar, unable to claim credit, unable to appear in public. The empire he had helped build was still running, but it was running without his name attached to it, a strange, hollow victory that must have felt like being written out of one's own story. The fans, too, noticed the absence. In online forums and social media threads, debates raged. Some defended Daniel, arguing that he had given fighters opportunities they would never have had otherwise. Others condemned him, saying boxing had been tainted by his involvement and was better off without him. Each side seemed to recognize that, love him or hate him, he had been a defining force, and that force had now been pushed to the margins. For Daniel, Dubai must have felt quieter now. The meetings were still happening, the phones still buzzing, but the world that had once celebrated him was moving on. The glamour of fight nights, the roar of the crowd, the bright lights of press conferences, all of it was happening without him. He was still powerful, yes, but he was also isolated. There is something haunting about this phase of his life. He had fought to escape the streets, to build something that would make his name echo beyond Dublin's gangland. He had succeeded, too well. His name had become known across the world, and now that very notoriety had forced him back into the shadows. This was the beginning of the fade, not a sudden fall, but a slow dimming of influence. The man who had once stood at the center of boxing's renaissance was now a ghost in the rafters, watching silently as the sport moved forward without him. And yet, the story was not over. For all the silence, for all the erasure, Daniel Kinahan was still out there, still wealthy, still connected, still a figure whose next move could send ripples across continents. But the days of operating in the open were gone. The era of being a kingmaker under the lights had ended. From this point forward, everything would have to happen in the dark, if it could happen at all. As Daniel Kinahan's public influence waned, another, quieter crisis was unfolding, one far more dangerous than fading headlines or cold shoulders from boxing promoters. The empire itself was beginning to crack from within. For years, the Kinahan organization had functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. Orders flowed down, money flowed up, and everyone understood their role. But under the pressure of international sanctions, frozen accounts, and constant surveillance, that carefully built structure began to strain. Inside the cartel, paranoia became a constant companion. Phones were used less often, meetings grew shorter, and trusted safehouses were suddenly abandoned for fear they'd been compromised. Associates started looking over their shoulders, wondering who might be under Garda surveillance, who might have been flipped by Europol, who might be secretly cooperating with the DEA. The fear was not just of rivals, it was of each other. Imagine a lieutenant driving home at night, headlights glinting off wet Dublin streets, feeling the weight of a car following 2 lengths behind. Is it the police? Is it Hutch gunmen waiting for their moment? Or is it someone from within the network, tasked with tying up loose ends? In such a climate, trust is a luxury no one can afford. Law enforcement understood this and used it to their advantage. The Garda and Europol began quietly approaching mid-level operators, offering deals in exchange for information. Some refused, clinging to the code of silence. But others, faced with the threat of decades in prison or worse, began to talk. Each defection was like pulling a brick from a wall, small at first, but soon destabilizing the entire structure. The first major betrayal sent shockwaves through the organization. A longtime associate, once considered fiercely loyal, began cooperating with police, providing details about routes, stash houses, and financial transactions. Raids followed, leading to seizures of drugs and weapons. More importantly, the psychological effect was devastating. If one man could turn, who else might be next? In Dubai, Daniel must have felt the walls closing in. Reports of arrests reached him daily, sometimes accompanied by rumors of who had flipped. Each new piece of intelligence gathered by police was a potential step closer to his inner circle. Meetings became more selective, access to him more restricted. The once smooth flow of operations turned choppy, slowed by fear and suspicion. Even the cartel's allies abroad began to reconsider their loyalties. Other criminal groups, in Spain, the Netherlands, even South America, saw weakness and began to hedge their bets. Some raised prices for shipments, others quietly shifted business to rival Irish crews. The Kinahan name, once a guarantee of power and reliability, was starting to look like a liability. And yet, violence did not stop. If anything, it became sharper, more surgical. Suspected informants were targeted, often in chillingly public ways meant to send a message: betrayal would not be tolerated. Bodies turned up in canals, in burned-out cars, in lonely fields. But each killing, rather than silencing the whispers, only seemed to deepen the cycle of fear. Associates wondered if they might be next, not because they had betrayed anyone, but simply because suspicion alone could be a death sentence. The psychological pressure was immense. Some lower-ranking members disappeared entirely, fleeing Ireland, abandoning the life altogether. Others tried to keep their heads down, hoping to wait out the storm. But storms like this do not pass quickly. They grind down everything in their path. Journalists began reporting on this atmosphere of fear, describing the cartel as increasingly paranoid, increasingly fragmented. Crime reporters noted that the once unified front of the organization seemed to be splintering into factions, with younger, more impulsive members clashing with older lieutenants over strategy. Some wanted to double down on retaliation, others argued for pulling back, consolidating what was left. For Daniel, this must have been one of the most challenging moments of his life. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now playing a high-stakes game of survival. Every decision carried enormous risk: crack down too hard on suspected traitors, and you might drive more people into the arms of the police. Show too much leniency, and the network might fracture from within. There is a haunting image of Daniel at this point, sitting in a quiet Dubai villa late at night, the city silent outside, a phone on the table in front of him. Each time it buzzes, it could bring news of another raid, another arrest, another betrayal. Sleep must have been elusive, trust even more so. And still, the net continued to tighten. More names appeared on sanctions lists. More warrants were issued. The U.S. reward offer stood as a constant reminder that even friends might be tempted by the promise of millions. The cartel, once a fortress of discipline, was now riddled with cracks, and each passing month widened them. The story of this period is not one of dramatic shootouts or headline-grabbing attacks, but of slow, relentless erosion, the kind of pressure that grinds down even the most powerful organizations. The Kinahan network was still dangerous, still capable of violence, but its aura of invincibility was fading. For those who had followed Daniel's rise, this was a striking reversal. The boy from Dublin who had built an empire, who had turned himself into a power broker in global boxing, was now watching pieces of that empire crumble away. And yet, he was still standing, diminished, perhaps, but not defeated. The question now was simple: how much longer could he hold on? Could the Kinahan organization survive the combined assault of law enforcement, rivals, and internal betrayal? Or was this the beginning of its final unraveling? Today, the story of the Kinahan cartel sits in an uneasy place, not quite over, not quite fully active, suspended between myth and reality. The once ironclad empire that stretched from Dublin to Dubai has been battered by years of law enforcement pressure, global sanctions, and relentless media exposure. Yet, like a ship that has taken on water but refuses to sink, traces of its power still remain. The Gardaí continue to describe the Kinahan group as one of the most significant organized crime threats to Ireland. Intelligence units still monitor associates, still track suspected money movements, still watch for signs that the cartel is attempting to regroup. Europol maintains an active file on the organization, sharing updates with member states. Interpol red notices remain in effect for key figures. The U.S. sanctions, with their multi-million-dollar rewards, are still in place, a standing invitation for anyone willing to help bring Daniel and his closest lieutenants to justice. And yet, arrests of the top leadership have not materialized. Daniel Kinahan, his father Christy, and his brother Christopher Jr. remain at large. Theories about their exact whereabouts vary. Some reports suggest Daniel is still in Dubai, living under tight security, moving only when necessary and rarely in public. Others claim he has left the UAE entirely, perhaps seeking refuge in countries with less cooperation with Western law enforcement. Sightings are reported from time to time, a photograph here, a rumor there, but nothing confirmed. He has become almost ghost-like, a man whose name is everywhere but whose physical presence is nowhere. For the public, this has added a layer of mystery to the story. There is something haunting about knowing that a man once so prominent, so photographed, can disappear in plain sight. True crime enthusiasts pore over every scrap of news, every leaked intelligence report, every investigative documentary, searching for clues. Journalists still publish long-form features attempting to piece together the cartel's current state, interviewing former associates, law enforcement officials, and boxing insiders. The cartel itself is widely believed to have been weakened, but not entirely dismantled. Large-scale drug seizures in Europe occasionally bear the hallmarks of Kinahan-linked supply chains, suggesting that at least part of the network remains active. Rival gangs in Ireland have tried to move in on territories once controlled by the Kinahans, but violence has not escalated to the levels seen during the peak of the feud. Some analysts believe this is because what remains of the Kinahan organization has shifted focus, operating less visibly, relying on proxies, staying out of the headlines to avoid drawing fresh attention. Money laundering, once the backbone of the group's financial power, has also grown more difficult. Banks are on high alert, offshore accounts have been frozen, and property deals have been scrutinized. This has forced what remains of the cartel to find new, more creative ways of moving funds, often turning to cryptocurrencies or informal money transfer networks. But each workaround carries its own risks, and law enforcement agencies are learning to monitor those channels too. Inside Ireland, there is a sense that the shadow of the Kinahan name still looms. In certain neighborhoods, the fear has not fully gone away. People still speak carefully, still look over their shoulders before mentioning the feud, still remember the days when a knock at the door could mean a bullet. The trauma of those years lingers like an echo, a reminder that even if the war has cooled, it has not been forgotten. Politically, the Irish government continues to push for international cooperation. Ministers regularly meet with their counterparts in the UAE, the US, and across Europe, urging further action. The message is consistent: the Kinahan cartel must face justice. This diplomatic pressure has had some results. Dubai authorities have reportedly restricted certain activities and moved to freeze assets, but a final resolution remains elusive. For Daniel himself, this period must be one of both isolation and constant vigilance. He is likely more cut off than ever before, unable to travel freely, forced to rely on a shrinking circle of trusted associates. Every phone call, every meeting, every transaction carries risk. The days of high-profile boxing deals and public visibility are gone, replaced by a quieter, more cautious existence. And yet, despite the global pressure, he remains a free man, a fact that frustrates law enforcement and fascinates the public in equal measure. Media portrayals of Daniel now swing between two extremes. In some stories, he is depicted as a fugitive mastermind, still pulling strings, still orchestrating a global network from the safety of exile. In others, he is painted as a man on the run, his power fractured, his influence dwindling, living more like a prisoner than a kingpin. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that the Kinahan saga has entered a new chapter, one defined less by public bloodshed and more by quiet maneuvering. The next dramatic moment could come at any time: an arrest in a foreign country, an extradition deal brokered behind closed doors, a dramatic trial that finally lays bare the full scope of the cartel's operations. Or perhaps the ending will be less dramatic, a slow fading into obscurity as the network fragments and dissolves under its own weight. For now, the story remains unfinished. Dublin is quieter, but still watchful. The boxing world has moved on, but it cannot fully shake the memory of how close it came to being controlled by a cartel. International agencies continue their pursuit, patient and determined. And somewhere, in a luxury apartment or a hidden compound, Daniel Kinahan lives in the knowledge that the hunt is not over, that each passing day could be the day when a knock comes at the door, when the past finally catches up with him. This suspended state, neither free nor captured, neither powerful nor powerless, is perhaps the most haunting phase of the entire saga. It leaves an open question hanging in the air, one that keeps listeners awake even as they drift towards sleep. How does a man live when he is both everywhere and nowhere, when he is a legend but also a target, when the empire he built is crumbling but still refuses to die? The story of the Kinahan Cartel has, over the years, taken on a life of its own. It is no longer just a matter of police reports, court cases, and investigative journalism. It has become a narrative, a legend, almost a modern Irish myth. For some, the Kinahans are seen as ruthless criminal masterminds with unlimited power, capable of ordering murders with a single phone call from a villa thousands of miles away. For others, they are portrayed as tragic antiheroes, men who rose from poverty, built an empire, and were hunted down by governments because they became too powerful. Somewhere between these two extremes lies the truth. Tabloid coverage has often leaned toward sensationalism. Newspaper headlines blared words like cartel kingpin, global drug lord, and Ireland's most dangerous man. Articles printed grainy photos of Daniel, sunglasses on, walking through airports, flanked by security, the kind of imagery that evokes Hollywood depictions of mob bosses. The feud with the Hutch family was often described in almost cinematic terms: Ireland's mafia war, gangland godfather versus the monk. Each killing was chronicled with dramatic language, every development treated as if it were the next twist in a crime drama. There is some truth in the drama. The Kinahan Cartel was undoubtedly one of the most sophisticated and far-reaching criminal networks ever to emerge from Ireland. The scale of their drug importation was staggering, moving tons of cocaine and heroin into Europe and generating hundreds of millions of euros. Their ability to operate across multiple countries, using shell companies, encrypted communications, and international contacts, showed a level of organization far beyond the average street gang. The bloodshed during the Hutch-Kinahan feud was very real, claiming lives and terrorizing neighborhoods for years. And yet, the mythology sometimes eclipses the reality. While Daniel Kinahan has been named by Irish courts as a senior figure in organized crime, he has never been convicted of running a cartel. Much of what is alleged against him comes from intelligence reports and police briefings, not from courtroom verdicts. In the absence of a public trial, parts of the story remain speculative, pieced together from leaks, informant testimony, and investigative journalism. This tension between myth and fact is part of what makes the Kinahan saga so captivating. On one hand, it has all the elements of a crime epic: a patriarch who rose from poverty, a son who became the charismatic face of the empire, a bloody feud, international intrigue, luxury hideouts, and a manhunt that spans continents. On the other hand, it is grounded in grim realities: drug addiction devastating communities, families grieving loved ones lost to violence, and ordinary people living in fear of stray bullets. The boxing world, too, became part of the myth-making. When Daniel stepped into that arena, he was sometimes cast as a shadowy puppet master controlling the sport, threatening its integrity. The truth is more complex. By most accounts, Daniel was effective at getting fighters opportunities and improving their pay, a fact that many in the sport privately acknowledge. Some fighters still express gratitude for the role he played in their careers, even if they can no longer say so publicly. To them, he was not a villain but a benefactor, someone who understood the business and fought for them. But the romantic notion of Daniel as a boxing savior is also complicated by reality. His presence in the sport undeniably brought scrutiny, controversy, and political pressure. Broadcasters faced boycotts, sponsors threatened to withdraw, and the conversation around every major fight became as much about organized crime as about the fighters in the ring. The dream of using boxing as a path to legitimacy was ultimately undone by the weight of the allegations, a reminder that no amount of glamour can completely wash away a bloody past. There is also the question of how much power the Kinahans truly still wield. Some portray them as a shadow government of crime, still controlling vast networks from Dubai or beyond. Others argue that the organization has been effectively dismantled, that what remains are fragments of an empire that once was. Intelligence reports suggest their operations have been severely disrupted, yet major drug busts linked to Kinahan routes still make the news from time to time. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, weakened but not gone, smaller but not fully defeated. For listeners, separating myth from fact can be challenging, but it is important. The Kinahan story is not just entertainment, it is a real saga with real consequences. People have died. Families have been torn apart. Entire communities have been scarred by addiction and violence. To reduce it to a Hollywood plot risks overlooking the pain left in its wake. And yet, there is no denying the magnetic pull of the story. Humans are drawn to tales of rise and fall, of power and downfall, of figures who seem larger than life. Daniel Kinahan fits this archetype almost too perfectly, the prince of a cartel, the kingmaker of boxing, the fugitive under international sanctions. He is at once feared and fascinated over, condemned and admired, hunted and elusive. Perhaps that is the final truth about the Kinahan saga, that it has transcended being merely a crime story and become a kind of modern parable about ambition, loyalty, and consequence. It reminds us that power, no matter how vast, invites scrutiny. That empires built in the shadows eventually face the light. And that the line between myth and reality is often blurred, especially when the main character is still alive, still free, and still out there somewhere, writing the final chapters of his story. As the story of the Kinahan Cartel reaches its quiet conclusion, one is left with a feeling that is neither triumph nor tragedy but something far more complicated, a lingering weight that settles in the mind long after the tale has been told. This is not the neat ending of a crime film where the villain is either killed or jailed, nor is it a romanticized finale where the outlaw rides into the sunset. Instead, it is a story that remains open, unfinished, suspended like a question mark over Dublin, over Dubai, over every port and backroom where the cartel once left its mark. The legacy of the Kinahan Cartel is written in two languages, one of blood and one of ambition. On one side, there is the undeniable human cost, more than a dozen lives lost in the Hutch-Kinahan feud, countless more caught in the crossfire of a drug trade that devastated communities. Families were left broken, children grew up without fathers, neighborhoods lived in fear. For them, the name Kinahan will always carry a chill, a memory of sirens in the night and blue forensic tents glowing under streetlights. On the other side, there is the story of extraordinary rise, a man who came from the council estates of Dublin and built one of Europe's most sophisticated drug networks, who expanded beyond borders, who turned himself from a small-time hustler into an international figure shaping the very future of boxing. For some, this is not a story of horror but of awe, a testament to cunning, discipline, and relentless ambition. It is this duality that makes the saga so magnetic, so haunting, so impossible to reduce to simple good or evil. When you close your eyes and think of Daniel Kinahan now, the image is strangely quiet. No gunfire, no flashing cameras, no crowded weigh-in rooms. Instead, picture a solitary figure in a luxury apartment high above a foreign city. The lights of Dubai, or wherever he may be now, sparkle below like distant stars. The phone is silent for the moment. Outside the window, the desert night is still. In that silence, one imagines him thinking back over the path that led here, the first petty crimes, the early arrests, the vision of something bigger, the blood that was spilled, the fortune that was made, the empire that was nearly unstoppable until the world itself began to close in. Perhaps there is pride in those reflections. Perhaps regret. Perhaps both. After all, every empire comes at a cost, and the cost of this one was measured not just in money and risk but in lives, in sleepless nights, in the weight of being hunted across continents. To rise so high and remain free is its own kind of victory, but it is also its own kind of prison. The world may not yet have put Daniel Kinahan behind bars, but it has caged him in other ways, in sanctions, in isolation, in perpetual watchfulness. For the listener, this final chapter is not meant to deliver easy answers but to leave a space for contemplation. What does it mean that a man can shape the destiny of entire neighborhoods, entire industries, and still be out there, somewhere, living behind closed doors? What does it say about power, about justice, about the line between respect and fear? These are questions with no simple answers, questions that linger like a whisper long after the story ends. The city of Dublin has moved on in many ways. New buildings rise where old ones stood, new names dominate the headlines, new generations grow up perhaps unaware of the terror that once gripped their streets. But in certain corners, the memory remains, a cautionary tale passed quietly in pubs, a name that is still spoken carefully, as if saying it too loudly might invite trouble. And somewhere, the story of the Kinahan Cartel is still being written. Perhaps there will be a dramatic arrest one day, a courtroom trial where all the pieces are laid bare. Perhaps there will be a quiet deal, a surrender negotiated behind closed doors. Or perhaps the ending will be less dramatic, the network slowly dissolving, the key players aging in exile, the empire fading into history without a final showdown. For now, though, it is enough to sit with the story as it is, a tale of rise and fall, of loyalty and betrayal, of ambition and consequence. A story that began in the narrow streets of Dublin and stretched across continents, touching lives in ways both profound and terrible. As the lights of this narrative dim, allow yourself to exhale. The gunfire has stopped. The shouting has faded. What remains is only the echo, a reminder of what power can build, and what it can destroy. And so, with the city quiet once more, with the desert night stretching endlessly beyond the window, we leave the figure at the center of this saga where we found him, half in shadow, half in light, a man who built an empire and who must now live with what that empire became. Sleep now, knowing that the story is still out there, unfinished, and perhaps that is what makes it so haunting. Because as long as Daniel Kinahan remains free, the final chapter has yet to be written.